Okay, so I want you to imagine something. You're in the absolute middle of a mental health crisis. Your world is spinning. And right then, in that exact moment, you have to suddenly become your own lawyer, your own expert witness, and your own doctor, all to fight for the right to control your own medical care. It sounds impossible, right? Well, this is the reality for so many people, a fight for their own autonomy when they are at their most vulnerable. We're going to dive into one of those stories right now. We're starting in October of 2025. A person's entire life is about to be put on trial. Not in a criminal court with a jury, but in a psychiatric hearing, where the stakes are honestly just as high: your personal freedom and your right to define who you are.
And this document right here, this is where it all begins. It's a petition for a judicial commitment, which is a really formal way of saying it's a legal process to force someone into treatment, whether they want it or not. For the person at the center of this, Jaden, this piece of paper kicks off a desperate fight, not just to get out of a hospital, but to be truly heard and understood for who they are.
In this quote, this gets right to the heart of the impossible situation. While in a crisis, a psychiatrist asks Jaden to just, summarize a lifetime of trauma. How do you do that? How do you possibly boil down decades of complex pain into a neat little summary? Especially when the very illness you're dealing with makes it incredibly hard to think that clearly in the first place. It's a completely impossible ask. So, to really get why Jaden is fighting so hard here in 2025, we have to go back. We have to rewind the clock. This resistance, this fight, it wasn't born overnight. It was built piece by piece over decades of really painful experiences. Just look at this timeline. The trauma just keeps compounding. Before Jaden was even 7, they'd had multiple severe concussions and had already lived in 4 different homes. At age 4, a sense of gender incongruence starts to form. Then, at 9, psychosexual abuse by an older role model. At 14, it happens again, re-traumatization by a trusted caretaker. So by 16, addiction starts as a coping mechanism. And by 18, Jaden is homeless and addicted to meth. You can see how each event just stacks on top of the last, building this incredibly complex foundation of trauma. And that foundation of trauma, it led to this heartbreaking and honestly predictable cycle of crisis. Over the years, we're talking 11 different ER and psych visits. The first overdose was in 2007, then meth-induced psychosis in 2012, a suicide attempt in a high-speed car crash in 2014. But then in 2016, something really important happens. Jaden begins to transition. And this was a huge, profound step toward healing, a way to finally address a core part of their identity that had been a source of so much pain. And throughout this long history of trying to get help, the system's main answer was medication. All in all, 14 different psychiatric medications were tried over the years. Now this slide tells you so much of the story. Of all those medications, the only ones Jaden felt were successful were hormone replacement therapy, the treatment that actually affirmed their gender identity. The other dozen-plus psychiatric drugs, in Jaden's experience, they were all failures. And Jaden's own words here explain it perfectly. To them, it felt like the system was just treating the pain, not the actual injury. It's like having a torn ligament, getting painkillers, and then being told to go sprint a marathon. It doesn't fix the root problem. The gender-affirming care, on the other hand, was treating the root problem. And this whole history, this is exactly why they were refusing more medication in 2025. Okay, so let's fast forward to the years right before that 2025 crisis. Jaden had started to find some stability, but then a series of just brutal external and personal blows sent everything spiraling. It was like a slow-motion collapse. Between 2019 and 2021, Jaden's living through all this intense social and political chaos, just soaking in the stress of a city on edge. Then 2023 hits, and a complete mental breakdown happens right as a long-term relationship ends. By 2024, that loss leads to being homeless, living out of a Jeep, and then the final, crushing blow. In October 2025, financial aid that had been promised, that was absolutely essential for survival, was suddenly denied. The very last safety net was just gone. And this is how the system saw it. This is how it was documented. A hospital report, October 22nd. Chief complaint: patient presents with suicidal ideation. Just cold, clinical, and detached. But behind that clinical note is a real human being.
Jaden explains that the news about the financial aid triggered what's called a dissociative fugue. It's this terrifying state where you can lose all sense of who you are and what's happening around you. And that fugue state is what led to the overdose. It wasn't some calculated decision, it was a profound trauma response.
So, this brings us right back to the hospital in 2025, where the battle lines are clearly drawn. You have the institution's view of what's going on, and then you have Jaden's own understanding of their life and their own mind.
And this table just lays the conflict out perfectly. The hospital's diagnosis: borderline personality disorder, major depression. Jaden's diagnosis, based on years of self-work and experience: dissociative identity disorder and PTSD. And look at that last line. What the hospital called non-compliance, Jaden defined as an informed refusal. They're not just two different opinions, they're two entirely different realities.
And wow, in this one single image, you see that fight made real. This is an official screening report, and that's Jaden's own handwriting, crossing out the hospital's diagnosis of borderline and writing, "I have DID." It's a literal act of rewriting the official story.
You can really understand Jaden's distrust when you hear this. Their condition had been labeled and relabeled so many times over the years. ADD, bipolar, schizoaffective. When the story keeps changing, how are you supposed to trust that this time the system has finally gotten it right?
At the very heart of Jaden's fight in court was this principle right here: informed consent. The argument was pretty straightforward. After almost 2 decades of bad, sometimes even harmful experiences with psychiatric drugs, they had the right to refuse a treatment that they knew from their own lived experience was not going to help. This was never about refusing all help. It was about refusing one specific type of help that had a history of making things worse. But this is the trap Jaden felt caught in. It was this impossible choice. To the hospital, it seemed like refusing one part of the treatment, the medication, was being seen as a total refusal of all care. And that, in turn, was used as the justification to try and have them committed. So, how did this all end? Well, the outcome of the hearing, it brings up some really big questions. Questions that go way beyond just one person's stay in a hospital. In the end, after arguing their own case from inside the hospital, a stay of commitment was granted. The process to force institutionalization was paused, and Jaden was discharged on November 14th. And, on paper, that's a win. But it was a win that only came after an absolutely exhausting, month-long battle that they had to fight while at their absolute most vulnerable. And you can just feel the weight of that fight in Jaden's own words. The whole struggle felt like a violation of their basic rights: the right to say no to a treatment, and the right to have their own deep lived experience taken seriously. And that leaves us with this huge, challenging question that Jaden's story really forces us to look at. It's a massive paradox in our mental health care system. Where is the line between a system trying to help and a system that's failing or even causing harm? And if you're required to be perfectly clear and lucid to fight for yourself, how can anyone possibly defend their rights in the exact moment their illness takes that ability away from them?